Welcome to the official YouTube channel for the Colin Cowherd Podcast. Go on, hit the subscribe button. There you go, right down there. If you want to be among the first to hear my weekly takes, NFL, college football, more, right there. So it's interesting this is kind of a vague topic, but I've always kind of measured how often I talk football. I don't work at the NFL Network, nor do I want to. I like the NBA. I like, an October, September baseball series. I like the World Cup, a good UFC fight. I like March Madness. I could never just talk football, and I've always kept the number around 65% of the show. But I was talking to a TV exec. I had a meeting about 10, 12 days ago with a really smart guy, and we were talking about the Big Ten. And he said, those ratings are going to go up 15 to 20%. And I had given college football about an 8-year break, a hiatus on my show, because it got very regional and very Southern. And I'm not anti-SEC, but if it was all... It
was Alabama, Georgia, and Clemson every year for 7 straight years.
Yeah, and so it's just like, listen, once baseball became very local, where nobody in Minnesota is going to watch the Mariners, nobody in Seattle gives a rip about Tampa Bay. Yet a Seahawk fan would watch the Buccaneers and Baker Mayfield play. So once baseball, about 10, 12 years ago, I felt it really got local. I just didn't talk about it. College basketball is a turnstile now between the transfer portal, one and done. You can't name the starters on Duke. But it is sort of interesting. I was talking to this executive about the growth of college football. He goes, you're not going to believe the numbers are going to explode. And he started talking about the Big Ten schedule. And he's like, you're going to get Washington, Oregon, or Washington, Michigan, Ohio State, Oregon, Penn State, USC. You're going to have 3 and 4 games in a row all day. And it did make me think as I was off this week. And I kind of shut it down when I'm off. I don't watch sports. I just leave. And there was nothing going on anyway. I'm watching the Warriors Nuggets today.
A crappy year.
But the biggest story in baseball last week, as the season starts, uniforms, they're kind of sheer see-through. Biggest story in the NBA was how bad the All-Star game was. The biggest story in college basketball was storming the court. Yet the NFL is the sport we talk about because we watch the games. Listen, if you're a fan, listen to what we talk about. When sportscasters, podcasters talk football, we actually talk about strategy in the games. That the NFL, with the growth of college football, which, by the way, between the draft and the combine, they're really starting to go hand in hand. College basketball and the NBA are the Grand Canyon. They have nothing in common. Most of the great players don't even want to play in college basketball. Yeah. College baseball, Major League Baseball, college hockey, they don't connect. College soccer and the MLS, they don't connect. College football connects with the NFL more and more. And I was sitting there this week watching people talk about sports, and I thought, am I going to do an 80% football show based on the audience? As I've said, the audience drives the show. What they want, I follow ratings, and I'm sitting there thinking, I don't want to work at the NFL Network, but John, between legalized gambling, people now stick through bad games, this massive, Big Ten SEC explosion, where now the 2 conferences are going to have all the games we watch. The ratings are going to skyrocket, the 12-team playoff. I was sitting there this week and I thought, Jesus, you're talking about see-through pants in baseball. Is that amongst your friends, when you go golf, does anybody talk about anything other?
No, football is the only thing that comes up consistently. But and I know a couple of guys and play golf with some former Major League Baseball players. They talk football. I mean, the Bills fan, a Packer fan, that's all they want to talk about. And during the fall, I think college football, like you said, think about next year, Texas, Alabama, Oklahoma, Georgia, Texas, LSU, the SEC and the Big Ten, it's going to feel like NFL light. Yep. I think the NFL, I've said this forever. I don't know if it's going to last forever my entire life. Like, I'm almost 40. Does that 40 years of dominating? When I was growing up, baseball was huge. The 90s with the Yankees, basketball with Michael Jordan. But for the foreseeable future, I don't see how that gap. I mean, the All-Star game, guys actively talk like, why would we even try to participate? Anthony Rendon, who's making $245 million. You see that story? He's like, yeah, baseball's not even a priority. It's like, well, I think for $250 million, you probably don't want to say that, buddy. It's like, can you imagine an NFL play? I think the relatability sometimes and I don't even blame these guys because you're getting $250 million guaranteed. Some of these basketball players. I played golf last week during the All-Star break with a guy that calls NBA games. And he was saying one problem is, and he's on a pretty high level team, but he just sees it around the league, it's always like you have to max everybody out. Well, you can't lose them. Well, is the guy a max player? Like we had to max Zion. Did you? Did you have to? Because in the NFL, you don't have to. And you would not. And so everyone's making all this money. I don't care who you are. If you're 25 years old and you're basically guaranteed to get an astronomical amount of money, you're going to be jaded in the way you think about everything.
Yep.
Where in football, it still has this old school meritocracy that if you do not produce within 2 years, I've seen it forever. It's why when I used to go to Niners camp a lot, like I'm not going to make it too big a deal about a third or fourth round pick because every year I've seen that third or fourth round pick. By the time training camp ends, the undrafted free agents beating him out. And might even beat out the starter. And all of a sudden, 2 undrafted free agents are starting. Guys are coming from everywhere. Every team. I don't care if you're a playoff team or a shitty team. And that's kind of like relates to our life. You got to produce. Whatever you do, you either generate revenue, get your job done, or you kind of get replaced. Where I think in basketball and baseball, it's kind of like scholarship. Once you get paid, like what am I going to do with you? Even in football, you're going to see so many names this week. You're like, God, I thought that guy was under a long-term contract. They're like, yeah, we're thinking about cutting him. If you won't take a pay cut, we're thinking about trading him. So basically every guy, we could probably name 30 guys that like untouchable in the NFL. A lot of them are quarterbacks. And then a lot of like high level Trent Williams, Travis Kelce, like those type guys. But basically every other name, you go half the Pro Bowl roster. You're like, yeah, they could move on from that guy.
Yep.
And I think basketball and baseball used to have an element of that. And definitely their guys were wired like, working in like local television in the Bay Area and meeting a lot of guys that played in the 80s and 90s, they had that attitude in baseball and basketball. Like, I can be replaced. I can be cut. They were very relatable individuals. That's why Charles Barkley's like one of the biggest TV stars of all time. He's relatable. I think it's much more difficult for the modern guy in that sport to be relatable because you're making $100 million guaranteed, whether you're good or bad. No one has a problem when you're good getting paid, but he's like, is this guy even Jordan Poole's making $130 million. He's like the worst player in the NBA.
Yeah. Well, and I've talked to a handful of execs, and I've brought this up before. They laugh at the NBA structure. They're like, what a joke. They make fun. NFL guys, I remember having this conversation a couple years ago when the CTE thing came down, and a lot of these Northeast media types who don't understand the passion for football in the Midwest or college football, they're like, it's the end of the NFL. I'm like, you've been in the Northeast way too long where baseball's still talked about on sports radio a lot. I'm like, football's not going anywhere. It's way too big to fail. There's way too much money. And they've cleaned it up. And nobody hits at practice anymore once the season starts. By the way, you get to the Super Bowl, usually the teams that get to the Super Bowl are missing maybe one starter. Like everybody's got guys are healthy.
The Niners and Chiefs were healthy.
Yeah. So there's the Chiefs a few years ago missing their tackles. And it was like, yeah, that's what happens. But one of the things, the structure of the NFL is the structure of most of our lives. You're tradable, cuttable, fireable. And I never understand fans. Like this is like where fans, I look at fans and I just think, you guys are out of your mind. This idea, I want my guy to get the bag. Fuck that. I don't want many players to get the bag because it limits my flexibility. I am always rooting for the team to sign a reasonable contract so it gives the team flexibility. I mean, this idea, like Dak's got a $300 million net worth after his next contract. He's fine. But you're not fine if you overpay players. But it is interesting. The NFL is the only sport, and I will say the MLS and hockey are the closest. NBA and baseball are a mess. That it's like you just.
I talked to a former hockey guy that played 15 years. I didn't know who he was, but we started BSing. He was one of the most relatable individuals. I had to Google him after. I was like, God, this guy played. They have a relatability to the way they talk and the way they interact. They're actually, I'm like, this guy could have talked to anyone in here and could have got along. It was very impressive.
Yeah, I met a guy at a bar in Naples one time, NHL guy. He was a Bruin. I didn't know him. Googled him, same. But I also think they have a very tight cap, and stars get paid. Everybody else makes a good living, not an insane living. And I'm not anti, I always said this, I'm not anti players making money. I'm not anti-mobility. But in any business, if you're paying B and C employees A money, you're going to have a problem. And I do think, and again, I love NBA playoff basketball. I really do. It's one of my favorite things. But NFL guys, executives, owners, they look at the NBA and baseball and they just laugh at their structure.
Well, I think one power of the NFL, like you said, about a random fan will watch not his team and know their players. I also think because the power, listen, we can argue over the franchise tag, whether it's fair or not. It's one of the healthiest things for the business by a mile. Because when Kevin Durant or Aaron Judge or Shohei Ohtani, when they hit free agency, there is no mechanism to keep them. And in those leagues, guys turn over a lot, which is not great for the league. If I'm the Kansas City Chiefs, I would imagine bottom 10 market in the NFL. If I want to keep Patrick Mahomes his entire career, or the Packers with Rodgers or Favre, I can until I choose to get rid of him. And that's healthy for my organization, for the league. The Chiefs were just in a Super Bowl, and they're easily now, I would say, one of the most recognizable brands in the NFL because of Patrick. And that's not really possible. Like in the NBA, if the Nuggets make the NBA Finals, it's not great. They would much rather have Steph Curry or LeBron in the NBA Finals. We're in the NFL, it helps to have the Niners there. But if it had been the Lions, maybe it's not 120. What is it, 115 million people still watching the Super Bowl? Right. It doesn't impact. And that's where I think the NFL has dwarfed everyone, that they're no longer dependent on markets, the brands.
Yeah,
their brands change by the player, by the quarterback, who if Josh Allen's healthy, he's going to be on the Bills for 15 years. And it's always been like that.
Yeah, if you go back 10 years, the CTE check, whenever it was remarkable to listen to so many sports writers. It was like, guys, you're tone deaf. You have never lived in the South. You don't get Texas. It was a lot of Northeast sports writers. It was a lot of this high-minded. Remember, Sports Illustrated started out covering fencing, had to be like persuaded to cover football. There is this sort of high-minded view of, college football, and it's like, guys, it's the best run sport. There was a great moment in the Dynasty series with Roger Goodell. Remember when they got rid of the tapes, put a hammer to him, got rid of the Spygate tapes?
Yeah.
And there was this media guy. Why'd you get rid of the tapes? And he said, well, because the punishment had been handed out. Well, but what about? And he said, no, the punishment had been handed out. There was no need for the tapes. Well, I mean, why? And Goodell said, tapes get out. He goes, like these got out. He goes, we destroyed them, and it shut the reporter up. But the reporter, he wanted so badly, Goodell got hammered for that he destroyed the tapes. And the point was, there was no value in those tapes once the fines and suspensions were handed out. Belichick was fined $500,000 at the time. Anytime, a lot of money, but at the time he wasn't making what he's making now.
Yeah.
And so Goodell gets a lot of crap because I think by and large the media doesn't like power. But like Dana White and Goodell, I'd argue, are the two best like commissioner CEOs of their sport. They're both, Dana's highly defiant, and Goodell, think about how big that industry is. Look at how leagues have dealt with societal changes, cultural changes, strikes. I've always thought Goodell, mostly because Goodell doesn't pander to the media. I've had dinner with him and drinks. You can ask Roger anything. He literally, I asked him on the air one time. He came on my show and I said, Roger, I love your sport. I don't know what a catch is. My friends don't know what a catch is. He acknowledged live on the air. He goes, yeah, Colin, it's a problem. That year, they changed it in the Super Bowl. Eagles, remember in that Super Bowl, the ball was juggled and they allowed it. What commissioner would have done that? I think when I watched the Dynasty, it was another reminder that the NFL is incredibly well run, and Goodell really has his shit buttoned up.